Okay, I suppose we'll start with Schoenberg, considering he comes earliest in the lineup.
To start, Schoenberg was the inventor of two main techniques that will be seen time and time again throughout this presentation: atonality and 12-tonality.
Before Schoenberg, music was, well, it had a structure, basically. People used scales, octaves, and regular time signatures that had been around for several hundred years.
Now, about atonality. Arnold Schoenberg developed this technique in 1909, describing it to a friend in a letter as music that demanded belief and conviction. It goes without saying that Schoenberg was one of the founders of musical modernism, cultivating, along with other artists like Igor Stravinsky, a group of musicians leaning towards atonality in their work. Schoenberg was born on September 13, 1874, in Vienna. He never had any formal schooling, and thus was a self-taught musician. While Schoenberg first created his atonal works in 1909, he would continue to develop it through 1923. Now, it first began as a very angry, jagged sort of sound, and then eventually started sounding lighter and lighter as the years went on. In 1910, Schoenberg applied to work as a teacher at the Academy of Music and Fine Arts, where he continued to develop his own style of music. Many saw atonality as a consequence of the times, the turbulence and death of World War I being a main factor, and as Hans Mersmann wrote, music had entered a stage of revolution, whose spiritual leader was Schoenberg. And yet others argued that atonality was caused only by internalized anxiety on his part. Either way, everyone agreed that it departed entirely from anything else that had ever been heard before. Really though, even Schoenberg didn't know why atonality developed. In another one of his letters, he wrote, "I am obeying an inner compulsion, stronger than any upbringing. I am obeying the formative process which, being the one natural to me, is stronger than my artistic education." Igor Stravinsky, an avant-garde composer in his own right, described Schoenberg as one of the greatest creative spirits of our day. Aside from being a musician, Schoenberg was also a painter. He believed that he could find a way to make works of art that he felt he couldn't make in music without the frame of tonality. Schoenberg was also good friends with Kandinsky, corresponding with him in letters quite often. Schoenberg actually didn't like the term atonality very much, and he also didn't like being associated with all the different movements of the day. For example, in one of his many letters to Kandinsky, "I find it perfectly disgusting, at least in music, these atonalists. Damn it all, I did my composing without any ism in mind. What has it got to do with me?" While fairly respected in most of Europe, in Vienna Schoenberg was practically vilified, though, as he wrote to the Academy, "All that might be brought up against me is that I write a kind of music that does not appeal to those who do not understand anything about it." In addition to writing music and painting, Schoenberg also had a career in laying down some pretty sick burns. In 1918, Schoenberg founded the Society for Private Concerts, where exclusively modern musicians performed to better accustom the public to its sounds. Now, originally this word was in German, but we can't pronounce it, so we're just not going to do that.
After his forays into entirely atonal music, Schoenberg desired music that was a little clearer and more methodical. Thus, he created 12-tone music. His 12-tone technique, created in the 1920s, departed from the normal major-minor scales by selecting a certain order for different tones to be played. Each note has to be played once before any repeated note can happen. While Schoenberg often followed loosely his own 12-tone rules, he followed this technique very seriously in OP number 31. his most famous works, Pierre Lunaire actually openly mocks religion, Mass, despite Schoenberg identifying as a Jewish or a Christian. Lunaire consisted of a spoken word performance that couldn't be more Germanic unless translated into German, and obsessed with numbers, numerology, and shocking the audience.
Den Wein, den man mit Augen trinkt, gießt nachts der Mond in Wogen nieder. Und eine Springflut überschwemmt den stillen Horizont. Gelüste, schauerlich und süß, durchschwimmen ohne Zahl die Fluten. Den Wein, den man mit Augen trinkt, gießt nachts der Mond in Wogen nieder. Der Dichter, den die Andacht treibt, berauscht sich und im heiligen Tranke gen Himmel wendet verzückt das Haupt. Und taumelnd saugt und schlürft den Wein, den man mit Augen trinkt. Es wohnt nichts bleiche Blüten, die weißen Wunderrosen blühen in den Julinächten, brech ich ein.
Schoenberg had to deal with many obstacles to his career. His reputation, bad performances, and also being labeled as a one-trick pony amongst other things. As he said, "My works are 12-tone compositions, not 12-tone compositions." In the Eastern world in Europe, the major player in music was Karlheinz Stockhausen, a very controversial figure, to say the least. The internet and many other famous people have a lot to say about him. Even if one might find all the various YouTube comments about him unfounded, Stockhausen was a pretty eccentric guy, from his orange jumpsuits to his life with his two muses and life partners, and the fact that he believed that he was born on the star Sirius. Amongst one of his many controversies, during a press conference regarding his work Licht, which we'll be talking about later, and 9/11, Stockhausen referred to 9/11 as the greatest work of art in the whole cosmos. For obvious reasons, this did not go over well. Now, here's the true context of this quote. There are people who are so concentrated on this single performance, and then 5,000 people are driven into resurrection. In one moment, I couldn't do that. Stockhausen grew up in Nazi Germany, and his entire family passed away during the war. In an interview, he recalled constantly hearing military marches on the radio, causing him to actually hate regular repetitive rhythms.
Stockhausen started from the University of Cologne and joined its electronic music club. Stockhausen made music under the concept of surrealism and psychology. For Stockhausen, music wasn't experimental or surreal with more than pitch, due to Schoenberg, but Karlheinz changed other aspects as well. Musical forms were arranged geometrically instead of normally. Stockhausen's music was composed of pieces called points, individual pitches, in groups of pitches, or movements. Stockhausen was the creator of electronic and surreal music.
Stockhausen's most influential electronic piece, called Gesang der Jungling, or Song of the Youths, published in 1956, features a heavily edited hymn sung by a young boy.
The Song of the Youths was recorded in 5 strands and pieced together. Stockhausen blurred the boundaries between speech and music in Song of the Youths. In Song of the Youths, the listener perceives sounds as moving around them clockwise and counterclockwise. If you don't mind my poor German, Den Herrn Preset is used to start every one of the phrases.
The goal of Song of the Youths was to fuse human voices with electronic sounds. He figured that vowels worked for the clearest pitch, while consonants sounded more like noises. He used vowels to imitate voice-like sounds, and primitive radio technology. The piece was originally supposed to debut in a church, But Stockhausen wasn't allowed speakers in church, and as you'll hear in a few moments, this is not the type of song that would be befitting of a church service.
Stockhausen used open form technique, pioneered by John Cage in the 1950s. One of Stockhausen's examples of open form is Momente. Stockhausen lets random chance play a part in his songs, lets the singers decide what part they're singing.
Perhaps Stockhausen's most memorable contribution to the music world. He helped establish the technique of serialism, which is atonal music only governed by mathematical equations and timing, rather than scales and harmony. Stockhausen's atonal techniques and early compositions were heavily influenced by Arnold Schoenberg, who was John Cage's own mentor, and Anton Weiberg. Licht is a thematic seven-opera cycle by Stockhausen about Lucifer, Michael, and Eve, which began in 1977, and then he finally finished it almost 30 years later. It's really less plot-driven and more thematic, with each opera representing a day of the week, and the reconciliation between the three main characters. As such, it's a little difficult to encompass the entire work in just a 2-minute preview, so instead it would be best for you to focus on the stylistic elements rather than the plot. In this piece, it shows both electronic music and his atonal work. Stockhausen is an experimenter, if nothing else. His long list of works includes Helicopter Quartet, written in 1995, wherein the musicians would perform overhead in helicopters, with sound and video being transmitted to the audience. Stockhausen has influenced many artists, including Pink Floyd, Sonic Youth, Frank Zappa, and the Beatles. In fact, if you look closely at their Sgt. Pepper cover, you can see him somewhere around the back left corner of it. Before his passing, Curtin acted as Stockhausen's center of gravity. A small village located east of Cologne, Germany. It acted as both a concert hall and a school of music.
The Stockhausen Foundation for Music was founded on November 14, 1994. Yep, all the documents that Stockhausen made are available for scientific research.
The next two artists we'll be discussing reside on the other side of the globe, in the United States. They are and Philip Glass, and they have a very closely linked history together. Both fall under the genre known as minimalism, were most active during the 60s, and had a feud for nearly 40 years before they finally buried the hatchet and performed together around 2012. On top of all that, they also shared a record label, Nonsuch Records, the nominal label without labels, being built alongside artists such as Bjork, Black Keys, Fatboy Slim, and Conor Oberst. Steve Reich and Philip Glass are often put under the category known as minimalism. But minimalism isn't just a genre of music. Minimalism is an art discipline that deliberately, severely restricts the materials and resources that an artist can be allowed to use. People like Bertolt Brecht, Dmitri Shostakovich, Karl Orff, and Sergio Leone of spaghetti western fame practiced minimalism in some form or another long before John Cage wrote 433. Even artists and authors like Patti Smith, The Velvet Underground, The Talking Heads, and Ernest Hemingway could be considered a form of minimalism. But our minimalism, musical minimalism, saw its heyday in the 1960s, where artists like Glass, Reich, and Cage were all major players in the scene. Minimalism emerged in its first form as downtown music in the early 60s, which really took off when Yoko Ono opened her loft on 112 Chambers Street as a performance space. Thus began a trend of non-traditional performances, with most downtown artists being relegated to dance halls and galleries, rather than concert halls or schools of music where traditionally uptown artists perform. The difference between uptown and downtown music, of course, being how easily digestible the piece was considered by the general public. The main characteristic of minimalism is called ostinati, or a short repeated phrase.
Terry Riley's In C and Reich's It's Gonna Rain, both released in 1964, are generally documented as being the first minimalist pieces. Minimalism is meant to be an objective and literal, being a reaction against abstract expressionism, which was all about self-expression. Music genres like dub, rave, punk, and techno have been influenced by minimalism, directly or indirectly, with a frequent melodic repetition and limited number of notes and chords. One of the biggest reasons why minimalism grew to its size was because of the Velvet Underground, who took the minimalist discipline, combined it with rock and roll, and pushed it into the spotlight.
19th century music was characteristically aimed towards stylistic purity. Reich sought to change music so it connected with people as a whole being, not just something to be listened to.
Reich moved his sound towards minimalism and away from modernist serialism in his work It's Gonna Rain.
It's Gonna Rain was essentially a recording of a Pentecostal street preacher about the end of the world. Reich put the sermon on multiple tape loops, messing with the sound and volume.
It's Gonna Rain was created when he played two copies of a tape loop into the left and right ears of a set of headphones at the same time. Instead of changing them, Steve let these phrases play themselves out.
He began to warn the people. He said, after a while, it's going to rain after a while, for 40 days and for 40 nights. And the people didn't believe him. And they began to laugh at him. And they began to mock him. And they began to say, it ain't going to rain. It's gonna rain, 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 it's gonna 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 it's gonna
Another one of Reich's most famous, and while we're on the subject, decidedly nightmarish works, is the three-part composition, Different Trains.
The first movement was recorded with voices from Porter Lawrence Davis. Different Trains was made to mimic the tones of human speech. The second movement of Different Trains come from childhood memories of Auschwitz survivors. Movement 2 is on the victims on the middle of the Holocaust.
On my birthday. The Germans will think. Walk into Holland.
Germans invaded Hungary.
Different Trains only serves to reflect, and not to comfort or to harm. Reich's music began to expand again when he reached the 80s, using more lyrics instead of being purely instrumental. An example of one of his early lyrical works in 1983 would be Desert Music, which was fragments of poems from William Carlos Williams.
Another example of Reich's lyrically themed pieces would be Talium from 1981, which was based around various Hebrew psalms. Steve Reich published a volume of collected essays in 1974 titled Writings About Music, in which he explained in detail his thoughts about his own music and the public's reaction to his music. In Reich's essay, Music as a Gradual Process, he stated that minimalist music was meant to be hypnotizing. It's like watching the minute hand of a watch. You can perceive it moving only after you observe it for a while.
Reich aided the classical movement from dying out, and done so by changing classical music itself.
Reich's revolution came from changing the focus from his technique to how the music actually made him feel. On the whole, Reich's music strived to have an intellectual involvement, instead of just being something that people can listen to, enjoy, and then forget about it by the next step. Now, to speak about Reich's label mate, the divisive and enigmatic Philip Glass. By many sources, Glass's music is often referred to as being minimal. Brian Eno's work was heavily influenced by Glass's work, calling it a viscous bath of pure, thick energy. He would go on to work with musicians such as U2 and David Bowie. Glass changed classical music to inspire people like the aforementioned David Bowie, Brian Eno, and Arthur Russell.
The music environment of today is much more open for young musicians because of the walls Glass broke with his music. Glass was required to start his own ensemble because no big groups would perform his pieces. We were mostly considered to be idiot servants at best, Glass referring to early criticism. Quote Glass referring to new concerts. I think it's about getting out of the conventional idea of concert halls and opera houses.
Glass is still a relevant artist today, with his music still being performed. Now, about his minimalist leanings. Glass's work, as you'll soon hear, is generally easier on the ears than most of his contemporaries.
Glass's Metamorphosis is one of his best examples of a strive towards minimalism.
Philip Glass and Chuck Close are famous friends, having met in Paris in 1964 while Glass was studying composition with Nadia Boulanger. Glass and Close's friendship included Close painting a photorealistic portrait of Glass, and Glass returning the favor by composing what he called a musical portrait of Chuck Close.
Glass changes between mediums when writing to ensure refreshing music processes.
In one instance of Reich speaking to Desner, guitarist of the band The National, "I don't make a destination between big and little pieces. I don't experience them that way." Glass also owns his own publishing company for his music, to ensure creative control over his pieces. A quote from Glass to Desner: "The old idea was, I had to be in every piece, or they couldn't book it." Glass's largest contribution to the music world was neither an unusual technique, nor was it a new style of music. Instead, he helped to break down the societal barriers blocking many a young musician from success.
John Cage studied music with Schoenberg, Adolf Weiss, and Henry Cowell. John Cage used randomization in his works to ensure the performers would not have a personal preference of parts. John Cage considered all sounds to be music phenomenon, rather than just instruments alone.
John Cage coined the term experimental music, which, in his words, was, "An experimental action is one where the outcome of which is not foreseen," such as, say, stuffing a dead fish in one's piano. In John Cage's book, Silence, he explains his relationship to sound, which is heavily influenced by Zen principles.
John Cage's 433 is the most famous piece, as the sound of the audience becomes the music.
John Cage's 433, you know the one, is widely regarded to be the musical equivalent of Duchamp's Fountain, conceptually profound, yet so incredibly confounding. According to Kyle Gann, 433 acts as a framing device, to enclose environmental sounds in a moment of concentration, and make people realize that all sounds can be music.
Goodman Peter declared John Cage's 433 to be the greatest piece of classical literature of the century. Which is more musical, a truck passing by a factory or a truck passing by a music school? John Cage. John Cage experimented with works for dance as well as music. John Cage used the prepared piano method, used with objects placed on or between strings.
Prepared piano has been heard not only in John Cage's works, but in other popular works as well, including in Velvet Underground's All Tomorrow's Parties, David Bowie's Fantastic Voyage, and the Grateful Dead's Anthem of the Sun. Prepared piano was created partially because of how John Cage enjoyed the duality of the tones produced, or two at once. Cage was hired to compose for dancer Sylvia Ford for her Bacchanal, and as there was only room for a piano on the side stage, he had to work with that. He couldn't quite produce the sound he wanted, an African 12-tone row, with the unaltered piano, and so decided to change it. After messing around with pie plates, nails, and eventually screws and bolts, Cage was finally able to make the sound he wanted. Thus, prepared piano was born.
John Cage turned to Zen Buddhism and other Eastern philosophies to make music.
In some of his later pieces, Cage relied on the Chinese I Ching divination system in regards to composing some of his pieces. We're still not entirely certain how this is supposed to work. John Cage collaborated with Marcel Duchamp on several occasions, most famously their 1968 piece Reunion. Released in 1968, Reunion was an art performance where the two artists would play a game of chess that would determine the form and sound of the event. Needless to say, things got pretty weird.
John Cage used words from James Joyce's novel Finnegan's Wake and Roratorio.
In Cage's Imaginary Landscape No. 4 from 1951, there would be 24 performers and 12 radios, 2 per radio, that would dial the different stations that were composed. This was thought to be the first electronic music concert.
All of the artists in this presentation experimented with tape recorders at some point.
Cage did most of what he did out of simple curiosity. What would happen if someone sat at a piano and did nothing? Apparently quite a lot.